Hi, I'm back. Okay, so what I have on the screen right now is an outline, a basic outline of the article as we have discussed it so far. So we talked about the introduction, setting up the problem. Then in the body of the article so far, we've sort of been with one main idea, that the ideology of Thomas Jefferson offers important clues in explaining this paradox. So far, Edmund Morgan has walked us through and demonstrated using primary source evidence that TJ thought that debt was dangerous. Debt was dangerous to the nation, to liberty, because people in debt could not be independent. TJ also thought that the landless poor were dangerous. And Morgan backed that up not only with some quotes from Jefferson, but some stuff from John Locke too. John Locke, a really important Enlightenment era thinker of political ideas. And so where we left off, we were on the top of page 10, talking about John Locke having this idea to force the landless poor to work, which is the opposite of freedom, right? So that's where we are. That's our outline, and we're still then working on this here. We're making an outline of the article's contents. And I will put this slide, this PowerPoint up on Blackboard for you all to see for yourselves. So anyway, Edmund Morgan continues to talk about this idea that the landless poor don't deserve freedom. The landless poor are dangerous. And I'll put this back here for a second. And that is a way of thinking about the ideology of Thomas Jefferson, which offers important clues in explaining the paradox of slavery and freedom. Okay, so there's this idea that we see in the writings of Locke, of TJ, other Enlightenment era people, that the people, well, poor people, the people in the lowest condition, the dregs of society, deserve to be poor. They arrived at that position through their own vice and misconduct. And that's an unexamined article of faith among 18th century Republicans. So Thomas Jefferson, John Locke, etc., had this unexamined assumption that poor people were poor because they deserved to be poor. So Morgan's going on, he's giving us more information about this ideology. What he's doing is using primary source materials, using quotes from the past to prove what he's saying. Okay, so here's some stuff about TJ. Oh, James Madison is in the picture, another important founding father. And so here we're getting into a little bit of discussion of slavery. Basically, what Morgan is saying here at the bottom of page 12 and top of page 13 is that Thomas Jefferson was worried that if the slaves were all freed, they would possibly stay in the United States. And once they ceased to be slaves, they would become instead 500,000 idle poor. 500,000 idle poor. Just kind of roaming around. Just like in Europe, there were wandering poor, landless poor, and they were a threat to liberty. So some more details on this idea here. And now, as I mentioned to you in your discussion or your study questions here, starting on page 14, Morgan turns from a discussion of the political thought of some important founding fathers to a discussion of the previous history of Virginia's labor force. So we're starting a new topic, and Morgan tells you he's doing that, right? He says, if we turn now, he's giving you clues that he's starting a different topic. He's going to be talking about the previous history of Virginia's labor force. So if I go to my outline, here's my outline. I'm going to start a new subject under body, and that is the history of the Virginia labor force. Then he tells us in great detail the history of the labor force, going all the way back to kind of what was going on in England in the 1500s and 1600s. So that's the time of colonization of the New World. Basically, what was happening in England was that there were a lot more idle, quote, rogues and beggars, poor landless people kind of wandering around England, and the efforts to cope with them increasingly threatened the liberties of Englishmen. So there's this idea that poor people are the opposite of liberty. Having a bunch of poor people around is the opposite of liberty. Now, Morgan does a great job of backing this up, again, with evidence from Hakluyt, who was a really important writer about colonization in the New World, Sir Francis Drake, a pretty cool pirate guy, privateer, who also played an important role in early colonization schemes in the New World. And then he gets specifically to Virginia. And he's saying from the very beginning, from before they even settled Jamestown, there was this very important idea that Virginia would be a spearhead of English liberty and also a haven for England's poor. So the poor, in theory, could go to the New World. There was a lot more land in the New World. They could, instead of being landless poor, own their own land and not be a threat to liberty. That was the idea. But then he talks about how that is not what actually happened. He's using Roanoke as an example, the so-called lost colony. And then he gets into Virginia as it was actually settled, Jamestown. He says, but contrary to this idea that sort of interacting with Native Americans would sort of magically transform the early settlers into people who owned land and were paragons of freedom. Instead, Virginia offered a bleak alternative to the workhouse or the gallows for the English poor. He talks about how really tough life was in Virginia, especially for the poor. There were a few rich guys, right, spreading up Virginia's great rivers, carving out plantations. There was a representative legislature, so we see the development of freedom. But it wasn't really for everyone. This freedom did not include everybody. So what was up with African Americans in Virginia at this time? He says, it seems clear that most of the Africans, perhaps all of them, came as slaves. But he also says a substantial number were free or became free. And all of them, servant, slave, or free, enjoyed most of the same rights and duties as other Virginians. So we don't yet see this sort of racialization, this color line, this drawing of a line between black and white and determining that white people, by virtue of being white, had more freedoms than everybody else. We don't see that yet. So going back to my little outline, the history of the Virginia labor force, we could say that there were ideals, prior to the settlement of Virginia. But then he's really talking about the reality, not the ideal. And he's saying there were African Americans who were part of the labor force, slave and free, but there were not yet a sort of racialized laws about freedom, who got freedom and who didn't. So what I'm going to do is just start a new slide right here, but continuing. So I'll just copy this, start my new slide, kind of remind us this is where we were. Okay. So he talks a lot about how there's this moment where it seems like African Americans may have had as many rights as white people in Virginia. But he says, well, it's not really quite that simple. It's not quite that promising. For one thing, Virginia was a death trap, at least probably until the mid-1600s. People who went to Virginia, white or black, most of them died very, very quickly until about 1640. And once that happened, once the population began to rise, it became increasingly difficult for an indigent immigrant to pull himself up in the world. It became harder to have social mobility because the population was on the rise and there was less land for everybody. So if I were to go back to my outline, and I would remember, okay, the kind of general topic we're talking about here is the history of the Virginia labor force. The ideals prior to the settlement, okay, we talked about that, and then the reality of the Virginia labor force. And one of those realities is that there were African American slave and free. There weren't yet racialized laws about freedom. Another reality of this Virginia labor force would be that in the 1640s, population began increasing, which limited, actually I'll say limited upward mobility. Okay, so I'm going to indent this couple, indent this one. That's kind of where we are in our outline. There's a presence then in Virginia of a growing class of poor people. And that was scary. That was scary to the rich people. They were caught in a dilemma, the rich people. They wanted the immigrants because they needed a labor force. But Virginia also then, with this new labor force, seemed to have inherited the problem that she was helping Virginia to solve, having a bunch of just poor, landless people wandering around. And in Virginia, these men were even more dangerous than they seemed in England. They were young. They were single, right? So young single men, as we've talked about in class, not necessarily the most stable group to start a society with. They were mostly men. Men outnumbered women because in English thought at the time, women were not suited to work in tobacco fields. Men were. So I'll start this up again in my next video.